So I'm just going to record about a few things that I've been learning about the last few days and a few deeper realizations. And so one of the things is that, when I was a child, the older generations were very dissociated from feelings, and emotion was seen as a weakness, and to show your emotion was to leave yourself vulnerable to being manipulated by a harsh world. And boys in particular were not encouraged to express their feelings. And there was a heck of a lot of bullying going on, which was largely all around picking on anyone who had feelings, who expressed feelings, who wasn't good at suppressing their feelings. And it's just very noticeable for me that when I was in my late teens and 20s, even into my 30s, I was very dissociated from my feelings, but not in a way that I'd rejected them, more in a way where I felt separate from my physical and feeling bodies, that I was very in the mental and the higher spiritual realms. I was very in the mind and the third eye. I was very visionary, very intuitive, but I was very much in other worlds. And therefore, in my 20s and 30s and 40s, I was aware that I had a lot of work to do to be able to come down into my feelings, to unblock whatever was stopping me from coming down into my feeling body. Just to bring that around to whatever's going on in the last year, what I'm finding in the last year is that the prison of the mental beliefs, those walls are melting. The mind itself is melting. The beliefs that were hardwired in the mind are being rewritten from some higher level than our individual minds. And for all that mental stuff, computers are the perfect analogy for describing that. And in programming, there's what's called global paradigms. In object-orientated programming, you're manipulating, moving things in an outward field, in an imaginary world, in a construction, a construct. But if something is changed in the global parameters, then that change happens on all the levels lower down than that. So everything that happens beneath the global in individual instances, if you change one of the parameters or all of the parameters on the global primordial coding, then that has a shimmering effect through all the computations that happen beneath that, using that. In terms of humans, that means that in our collective psyche, things are changing on subconscious levels in the imagery of how we see things in the world. One of the greatest things that's going on these days is the polarization. Because polarization is actually making it more obvious that we have a choice. But also making it more obvious that maybe some of our choices are just biased. They're not actually healthy choices. And that a lot of the more extreme choices need deep healing. It also makes it aware of where there is hatred in our lives. Hatred that could be risen up to love. So in this point, I'll go back to global parameters and talk about Venus. For the last few weeks, Venus has been in what's called retrograde, and retrograde sounds like it's going back on itself. And in some ways, going back on itself sounds like a negative thing, reducing numbers, negatives. But really what's going on is that Venus is closer to the Sun than the Earth. And so as Venus is going around the Sun, from the Earth's perspective, sometimes it looks like Venus is going back on itself. So here's a circle, and there I am close to the Earth, or close to the camera, and I'm going around in a circle. And at the moment Venus is here, it's right behind the Sun. So the Earth is here, Venus is here, Mercury is here, the Sun is here, and Venus is behind the Sun. So at the moment Venus is not visible in the sky. And at the moment That's what's called Venus has gone into the underworlds. And in the religious cosmology, Venus is associated with Lucifer, Lucifer is associated with the fall is associated with darkness and negativity and hell. The underworlds are associated with hell. And so Venus being Lucifer, Lucifer being the light bringer, we're really talking about the light of love being brought down to earth to experience life in the earth, where there are material dog-eat-dog global parameters. And over time, those global parameters of it's a harsh world out there, you got to kill or be killed, are becoming more heart-based rather than mental or lizard-like kind of thing. So the survival instinct is somewhat coming out of its post-traumatic stress disorder to be able to feel heart joy rather than merely a black and white world of tragedies. So in a few days' time, maybe 4 days' time or whatever, Venus comes out the far side of the sun and becomes visible again. So in this period where Venus is in her debt, there's the dying off, much like in a female period of time. So in this last few weeks, for all of us, whether male, female, or whatever else, we've all been in a phase of feeling quite dissociated from the world and retreating from the world to go into a liminal space in which to re-dream, to come up with new dreams where old dreams have failed, to come up with new adaptations of how can this work in the modern day compared to my childhood dreams. And so in these last few weeks there have been a lot of things coming up in the daytime reality that are very challenging, and yet those challenges say, well, actually reassess the whole thing. Maybe how you've been looking at it doesn't have enough information. Maybe you need to think about things a little bit differently. Maybe you need to feel into things more. And over this last week or two, it becomes easier to imagine the kind of life that you would like to live simply by letting go of what you now know you don't want to live. So if you're in a job that you don't really like, where it's all very controlling, and you realize I could be self-employed in a creative industry, then having the confidence to trust yourself to be able to make your own way in life instead of having to be employed by some system, as an example. So tied into that with what I've also been experiencing lately is an idea of when we were kids, we were traumatized, we were beaten, we were slapped, we were hit with rulers and sticks in order to try and teach us to conform. Quite a brutal world back then. So there were all kinds of manipulations against children to stop them from being too joyous, too noisy, too free. When our parental and grandparent generations were living in such a harsh world with the PTSD that they all had, and with the fear of the future that they all had, and with the idea that you must buckle down and be educated in order to survive in this world, in order to get the better jobs in a rat race. Whereas these days what's been encouraged in everybody really is creativity. And while so many people now have the sudden fear that the AI is going to take away all our jobs, it's really only taking away jobs that are not creative. Jobs that can be done by a machine, in other words. Jobs that are systematic jobs for the system, that the computer can now run those systems instead of having to employ people to be stuck in offices with people they don't even like, pretending that they like their jobs when they don't. And not being very efficient in jobs that they didn't like anyway, or in jobs that they weren't quite well suited for, kind of thing. So again, the whole fear of the future mean not feeling good about your future, the whole depression that goes along with that, the whole rejection of the system and being stuck on the dole, or been brought up under such difficult circumstances that in estates all over Britain and all over the world, there are parts of the world where people can only have menial jobs because of where they're from, because of their race, their colour, their religion, their backgrounds. Even native people of most of the countries, including Britain, the native people find it very hard to get decent jobs, decent well-paid creative jobs or whatever, because they've been brought up to genetically descended from people who just worked in factories. Anyway, all those jobs are being outmoded, and it appears it's all being pushed by the WEF and that they're a bunch of bad people and all the rest of it. And apart from having opinions about who's creating the future and creating a future we don't want to live, it's still up to any of us to have to be resourceful enough and independent enough and intelligent enough and to feel confident enough to create our own future in a creative manner. So that's to be masculine enough, not to say man, but masculine, outer, creative enough to raise up our own inner spirit, to raise up our own feeling and to raise our expectations on life, that we can achieve great things in our own little lives in humble little ways, in the bringing up of our children, in the helping friends, and in earning a living doing things that you actually love doing, that bring you joy, rather than having to go to work just to bring in money, just to pay bills, just to always be in debt. So all these traumas, including the financial traumas, have been coming up for quite some time, and we've lived through them. And like the sun coming out of the underworlds, like the Venus coming from behind the sun, coming up from the underworld, these traumas are healing. That's one of the biggest things that I see has changed over the last year, is the amount of people who are actually recognizing healing is a very real thing, a very simplistic thing. That the difference between healing and just taking pills is a very big difference. That healing's got a lot to do with changing your lifestyle, not merely going for cancer treatments with radiology and chemicals. That there's a lot we can do about choosing the kind of food that's really good for us, that we actually like eating. More fruit, that kind of stuff. There's a lot to be said for not rejecting all of the science just because a lot of the science is very crude. There's a lot of sense in not rejecting the logic of the universe, even though science is not translating it very well yet. So in a lot of what I've just said there, I'm really kind of talking to truthers, many of whom are really not functioning in the healing realm, because their beliefs in an evil running the world is the antithesis to the idea that there is a creative mother of this earth, and that the whole process here is for love, loving light, loving spirit, to be able to come down into the earth, into the feelings, into what has been wrong in the past, into what was not possible to heal yet in the past. And that it's not offering a hope tied to despair to say that the direction the world is going is in a direction of healing the overall picture. And over this last year, it's really become a thing for me to be able to see that things could heal within 2 or 3 years instead of taking thousands of years. The kind of hopes that were being spoken about in the run-up to 2012, that when 2012 came, there was no sudden great enlightenment, there was no revolution that took power back from the governments, there was no fulfillment of those expectations exactly. But here we are 11 years later, and so many of those themes are actually becoming a reality by now. And yeah, I will also mention just about Sinead O'Connor's death. Has brought up everything about her life. I see quite a few truthers on comments under posts about Sinead O'Connor really just being relatively nasty people hating on Sinead O'Connor because some 2 or 3 things that she stood by in her life are not what the right-wingers stand by. The anti-vax people, the anti-lockdown people, the essentially racist people who are nationalists. Now, so many of those things that are the far right side of conservatism, they do exist, and they give a bad name to all the other people who are loving but are concerned about extreme leftism. So it's just very revealing to see somebody hate upon somebody who's died just because, oh, she was pro things that other people are anti. It just shows how beliefs can be full of hate, even in nice people. And so I've got a little phrase in my head about the Sinead O'Connor effect, that now that she's died, there's a Sinead O'Connor effect in which, on a soul level, lots of things are being recognised now that were not recognisable 50 years ago or 40 years ago or even 30 years ago. And she was ahead of her time? No, she was ahead of other people's time, in that she was calling out the abuse going on in the church. She was calling out the abuse going on in the music industry. She was calling out the abuse that goes on generally in society in the Western world. She was calling out the abuse that's going on from men against women, but also from women against men. That there are patriarchal women so programmed by the patriarchy that they're equally as brutal. And really the overall understanding that this was programmed into her life from such an early age, that her mother's abuse to her gave her a mother wound, that the adoration that she was given as being so beautiful caused her to go, look, I don't feel that beautiful and I don't want to be called that beautiful. I actually feel like a worthless piece of shit because of my childhood, and my self-image is not the same as this very challenging image that tells me I'm great. Personally, for me, I empathise with not being able to handle being told that you're completely brilliant, not being able to handle praise, simply because I've been programmed from youth of not getting praise and being told that you're a piece of shit. And whatever people may say about how sad it is that she had mental health problems or emotional problems, or that she died at 56, but the other side of it is just recognising that on a soul level this woman endured 56 years of extremes, including being really one of the most hated people on the planet in terms of the Western world. At some stage, just after she'd gotten famous, she got completely smashed down for not being a good girl and acting like the others would act. So she stood out for the crowd. She tore up the Pope. She tore up the church. She tore up the music industry. She tore up interviewers, whether male or female. She tore up her relationships. She acted out what she was really feeling, even if it was destructive. She had what many people might call failed relationships. She had children with various men. But she was a good mother to those children. As best she could. She had the intention to be a good mother. She learned to heal. She wrote songs. I mean, man, she could have written 100 times as many songs in the world, but she was careful to put out songs that were healing. Thank you for healing me. Thank you for hearing me. Thank you for hurting me. Thank you for loving me. So the level of processing that the lady did in her life, and it's at the time in the run-up to this Venus retrograde, and it's at the time where I would certainly say the tables are turning, where what was inverted is becoming the right way up again, where who one is on the inside is finally being seen in the outside. And while she's just an image in our outer screen of the so-called reality we think there is, foisted upon us by the entertainment industry and our screens and all of that stuff, it really brings up the difference of people who can see through a soul level and can feel into what's really going on, beneath the surface. That ultimately either what's going on is healing and loving, or this world might as well be a computer simulation. If our feelings aren't appreciated, our feelings is how we actually interpret what life is like. Our feelings is how we actually improve our circumstances. So the idea of unconditional love has often been victimized, that somebody who didn't put up strong boundaries and have many conditions would get battered down by this world. And it's not until those systems which rule the world become less hateful that we can live in a world where we can be unconditional in accepting other people. The only rule there is accepting other people and the rising tide that rises all ships. And if I can allow more love to come into the world through my vessel, through my family, through my relationships, that helps other people bring more love into their lives and relationships. Which, if you think of love as being a substance, means that the world is filling with a substance that is loving more than filling with the passing on of hatreds, the passing on of boundaries that shut people out, the passing on of inequalities. Anyway, yeah, I'll leave it there now. That's my little thoughts for today, and much love to you all, random people out there in a random world. Yeah, and the subtler thing that there are so many ideas that are too sensitive to try and explain to the ordinary people of the world, but then very few ordinary people of the world are listening to me, so I don't really have to worry about being misunderstood or sounding too cosmic. What I want about here is just that there are subtler energies in the world which are now being absorbed by our bodies and our energy bodies and our emotional bodies. And for those people who are shut off from their emotional bodies and just living in a purely mentalistic world, there's a lot that those people are not sensitive to and are not being aware of at the minute. And in many ways, they're just putting up bigger and bigger boundaries. But this idea that the trauma needs attention. And so the traumas come up in order to bring the mind to have awareness of what's happening in the feelings instead of just blanking them out. So the idea here that any of us can heal. It's just a willingness and the awareness that healing is needed, and to make opening in one's life to heal the relationship between the inner male and the inner female, between the mind and the emotions, and to house that in our physical bodies, to express our self-love through taking care of ourselves better. It doesn't have to be pampering and narcissistic filters. It can really be just spending time with ourselves, recognizing what's good about ourselves, and having conversations with ourselves where we have been programmed to think that we are bad or dirty or criminal or too spaced out or too fat or any of these things, the so-called negative emotions. We all have so-called negative emotions, and if we could see them correctly, they're not really negative at all. They're somewhat out of balance and somewhat bullied by the other parts of life. So with the mind, rather than, I don't necessarily seem to say too many positive things about the mind. That's just in a recognition. That's just in a recognition that it's just in a recognition that that in the relationship between the feelings and the mind, I noticed in myself that my mind had to learn to renegotiate with the feelings in order to have any success in life at all on any real meaning level. That over the last few years, sensitive as I am, I do notice how my mind can overrule the intuition, and by overruling the intuition create far more complicated attempts at solution that just made more problems in many ways. And so I'm trying to communicate here that, yeah, the phrase that come up with lately is that the mind is a smokescreen. So the mind is producing all of this information all the time, and that information is just recycling past into futures. It's just tons of analysis. If the mind is analysing information that isn't clean in the first place, if it's analysing information that's full of bias, full of personal programming, full of the programming of people who were around when you were a child who in no way were correct about the things they programmed you with. So there has to be a renegotiation between the mind and feelings, because the feeling is open to so much new information that is true and is loving, whereas the mind is filled with so much information which is not quite true, and all too often not loving, but is self-critical and judgmental of others, judgmental of the world, judgmental of God, judgmental of the devil. And so this word about ego, all these spiritual circles, and they talk about evil, and it's all about demonizing the ego, that the ego is somehow a bad thing that you have to overcome and get rid of and cut out. And I had a good breakthrough chatting with a friend the other day. He was talking to me about the idea of NPCs, which is to say non-player characters, which is to say that so many people in the world are on autopilot, they're not really making decisions. Then he and I were both able to own that that applies to us as much as anyone else. There's a lot of using the word NPC as if other people are unawakened and therefore other people are not really real, and there's a superiority complex going on in there that has a big blind spot. So we were both talking about how, yes, this world is like a simulation in the sense of this world is a shadow realm. Mostly we're seeing shadows around us, we're not seeing things in their true light. Things are filtered through the veil, kind of thing. So the resolution down here, like in everything I'm chatting about there, they're not really having feeling, the mind's not really feeling feelings, and the feelings being so suppressed as we couldn't process those feelings, and those feelings are like colour in the time of black and white television. And now colour is the most wonderful thing of all, and now we're on 4K colour and 8K colour. And we're seeing colour in so many better lights. So non-player characters is really talking about the automation, and that automation is our artificial mind, and our artificial mind is full of artificial information, which is mostly dodgy information, which keeps us all working in a system and voting for democracies where the billionaires are getting richer and the rest of us are struggling, that kind of idea. So to be able to free your mindset from the stations that were only available when you were a kid, and realize that now one's mindset can be picking and choosing from all kinds of mindsets that the internet makes possible of information gathering. And the coincidence of meeting other people who actually share interests with you, and if your interests are to do with healing, there are so many more people on the healing path to bump into these days who can teach us simple things about our thoughts, about herbs, about feelings, about alternative therapies, which is basically just going to nature instead of utterly dependent on mentalistic science solutions. And to go a bit further, to not see the ego as being demonic and devilish, but actually see that the ego is like an operating system. It's like Windows in your computer is an operating system. It's a software. And yeah, it's pretty clunky software in the past, although it has such a subconscious amount of dodgy programming and cookies and trackers and basically astral plane demonic stuff going on inside in our programming. But we're all, every day, subconsciously having our programming upgraded. The artificial collective consciousness, intelligence, is upgrading the global parameters. And we're finding it easier to become more enlightened, and in some senses shedding so much of the weight of the world and being able to trust in not a religion, but in what the religions were originally based on, which is the miracle of life. And instead of feeling like, oh, I can't afford to have children, the recognition that what one gains from interacting with other people is more than just financial debt. That there is an abundance of joy in the world, and that joy is worth far more than any money or any belief system that strips the joy from the world. So just to reframe all that, that for any of us who understand what astrology is, but to be conceived, that there's a conception chart, and that conception chart kind of plots a soul level map inside the gestation in the womb towards the birth. And there's a chart for the birth chart, which is where the breath, the first breath of life, is drawn, and the whole system switches on, the whole physical mental system switches on, the whole memory recording system. Our artificial intelligence switches on when we first actually breathe air into lungs, rather than merely breathing through the umbilical cord surrounded in our sac of liquid. So in a way, our NPC, our non-player character's bias, our ego's bias, our mental bias, our trauma bias, all of that so-called destiny that becomes our ego, that's all really set in the birth chart. We could say a different way of seeing the ego is to see it as your own birth chart, instead of seeing it as some debilitating entity who's always going to drag you down and tell you the wrong choices. And it's about improving the information that our ego has access to. And on the healing level, recognizing that the global parameters of the ego, of the operating system, are improving these days. And what's going on inside of us is equivalent to whatever the AI is doing. So the AI is just doing something that's happening, just like what's happening in our minds is healing something that's just happening. And this is the unconditional love aspect of things. So in principle, it's like the shadow cannot stop light from shining. Just let that sink in, that in the world out there, there's really no point in fighting our shadows. Really, we've got to realize that we're the ones creating the shadows, and that we can bring light into those shadows, and that there's nothing wrong with shadows. Anyway, bye for now.